In the bitter cold of the 1888 Allagash winter, 200 yards separated survival from desperation. In one camp, belonging to the Prentice Logging Company crew, Foreman Hiram Greeley and his 12 men shivered in a cluster of smoky, drafty brush huts. The air inside their shelters, barely 30 degrees Fahrenheit above the 22-degree outside air, was a fog of wood smoke and misery. 200 yards upstream, in a small hollow facing south, the guide Silas Vane sat in his shirt sleeves, mending a snowshoe by the light of a single candle. When the company physician, Dr. Eris Blackwood, pushed his brass-cased thermometer into the air of Vane's lean-to, the mercury held steady at 54 degrees. It was 46 degrees warmer than Greeley's camp. This single, quiet man, using less wood, was not just surviving. He was comfortable. What did this guide understand about heat, air, and the very ground he stood on, that an entire crew of hardened, experienced woodsmen had completely, dangerously missed? The race for Maine's green gold, the towering white pine, had pushed men deeper into the northern wilderness than ever before. The year was 1888. The Prentice Logging Company, like its rivals, relied on mobile crews of axemen who set up temporary winter camps. The official shelter, the one passed down from foreman to foreman and detailed in logging pamphlets, was the brush and bough hut. It was a structure of pure expedience, designed to be erected in 2 hours by a 4-man team. The manuals were simple: find a thicket of spruce or fir, cut poles 3 to 4 inches in diameter, and lean them together in a simple A-frame or lean-to shape. The walls were to be thatched with a dense layer of evergreen boughs, laid 3 feet thick. This was the wisdom of the day. A fire was to be built either in a central, smoke-filled pit or as a massive, roaring log pile fire just outside the open front. This was the accepted practice, trusted by every man on the crew. It was a philosophy built on the assumption that the toughness of the man was the primary insulation. The shelter, in their view, was just a rudimentary windbreak, but the wind in the Allagash did not break. It shattered. Hiram Greeley was a man who trusted this conventional wisdom completely. He was a product of it. He was large, loud, and believed in man's strength above all else. His camp, built in a clearing exposed to the northwest wind, was a testament to this brute force philosophy. He had a crew of 12 men, and they had built 3 large huts, each roughly 15 feet long and 10 feet deep. The construction was orthodox to the letter. They had felled dozens of young fir saplings for the main poles, lashing them with jute rope. The walls were a dense lattice of spruce boughs, laid thick and heavy. From a distance, they looked robust, almost picturesque. Up close, Dr. Eris Blackwood, the company physician hired to keep the men alive, saw them for what they were: thermal sieves. "The bow wall is a fiction," he wrote by lamplight in his journal, his ink turning to slush. "It blocks the sight of the wind, but not the passage of the air. It is a porous, uninsulated membrane." He recorded the data. At an external temperature of 10 degrees, 23 degrees, the air temperature inside hut number 2, 5 feet from the central fire pit, was a mere 18 degrees, 8 degrees C. The smoke was so thick it forced the men to sleep with their faces pressed to the frozen ground, where the coldest, heaviest air pooled. Worse, the huts consumed wood at a rate that alarmed Blackwood. Each hut required 1 man at all times to be on fire watch. This man was not resting. He was hauling and feeding the fire, fighting a losing battle. The crew's productivity was falling not just from the biting cold, but from sheer debilitating exhaustion. Their shelter was a machine for sapping energy, warmth, and morale. Silas Vane was not a logger. He was a guide, hired by the company to scout timber tracks, making 50 cents less per day than the top axeman. He was a quiet man of 40, originally from the Vermont hills. His experience was not with large, noisy crews, but with solitude and silence. He had not learned his trade from logging manuals. His defining experience had been 2 winters, 1879 and 1880, spent far to the north near the St. Lawrence River. He had been trapping for marten and fisher, and after losing his own supplies in a canoe accident, had been taken in by a small family of Penobscot. He had arrived at their winter camp expecting to find a crude, primitive existence. Instead, he found an efficient, warm, and sophisticated one. They did not fight the winter, they used it. They had taught him, more through action than words, the fundamental principles he now saw as inviolable. He learned the value of ground heat, that the earth itself was a source of warmth. He learned that air penetration was the primary enemy, more than the cold itself. And he learned that trapped air, or dead air, was the greatest insulator on Earth. When Hiram Greeley's crew began building their drafty bow palaces in the exposed clearing, Vane simply shook his head, shouldered his axe, and walked 200 yards upstream to a south-facing slope, sheltered from the wind by a trio of large pines. "Too good for my men, Vane," Greeley had shouted, his voice mocking. "Building your own palace?" Vane just raised a hand and kept walking. Vane did not build a hut. He began by digging. He used his snowshoes first, clearing a space 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep. Then, with a short-handled pick and a spade, he attacked the frozen earth. The loggers who watched him during their break scoffed. "He's digging his own grave," one yelled, and the others laughed. Vane ignored them. He excavated a rectangle 18 inches deep into the sandy, rocky soil. This was his floor. He then cut poles, but his were smaller, leaner, mostly alder and birch saplings. He erected a simple lean-to frame, with the long, sloped back, the north wall, angled at a low 45 degrees. This wall, however, was his secret. He built 2 of them. A light inner frame of saplings woven tightly with willow shoots, and a second, outer frame, built parallel to it, 14 inches away. This 14-inch cavity was the heart of his invention. For the next 2 days, while Greeley's men were cutting massive 8-inch logs for their fires, Vane was gathering his own fuel. But it wasn't fuel for the fire, it was fuel for the wall. He gathered bag after bag of dry moss from beneath the snow, stripped dry, fibrous bark from dead cedars, and collected clumps of dried grasses from a frozen beaver meadow. He meticulously packed this cavity, tamping it down with a stick until it was a dense, 14-inch thick wall of pure trapped air insulation. The roof was built the same way. The floor he lined with a thick 2-foot mattress of fresh fir boughs. This was not for comfort, but for science. The boughs trapped air, creating a cold sink beneath his sleeping platform, separating him from the 18-inch deep, 30-degree earth. When he was finished, his shelter looked less like a structure, and more like a high, compacted bank of forest debris. The conflict between the two camps was one of fundamental philosophies, a head-on collision between 2 opposing theories of thermodynamics. Hiram Greeley's philosophy was brute force. His huts were an attack on the cold. He believed that if you built a large enough fire, you could heat the entire North Woods. His shelter was merely a place to put the fire. Heat was generated in massive, inefficient convective bursts. It radiated up into the sky, out into the woods, and was actively sucked through the porous bough walls by the wind. The men were warmed only by direct, scorching radiation on one side, while their backs, 5 feet away, were freezing from the drafts. It was a system of conduction and convection that worked against the occupants, demanding more fuel for less warmth. Silas Vane's system was the opposite. It was a philosophy of conservation and efficiency. "Greeley's fire heats the woods," Vane quietly explained to Dr. Blackwood. "My fire heats me." His lean-to was an engine. The 14-inch thick insulated wall, packed with moss and duff, had an R value that was likely 20 times that of Greeley's bow wall. It stopped conduction. The tight weaving, banked with snow and earth, prevented convection, drafts. The only major heat loss was radiation from the open front. And Silas Vane, the trapper who had learned from the Penobscot, had a plan for that. Dr. Blackwood began his formal observations on the 3rd night. The temperature had plummeted to 20 degrees, 30 degrees C, and the air was perfectly still. His instruments were simple but accurate: a brass-cased mercury thermometer, an anemometer to measure air movement, and his logbook. He first visited Greely's hut, Nova 1. Time, 9 p.m. Ext. Temp, 20-22°. Inter temp, center, near fire, 28°, 2°. Int temp, sleeping area, back wall, 8°, 22°. The men were already in their bedrolls, huddled together, coughing from the smoke. The air inside the hut was moving at nearly 2 miles per hour, a constant, freezing draft. He then walked to Vane's lean-to. The first thing he noticed was the fire. It was not a bonfire. It was a long, narrow watch fire, running the 12-foot length of the lean-to opening. And behind it, Vane had built a second wall, this one of green, freshly cut maple logs, stacked 3 feet high and angled slightly. This fire reflector was Vane's second trick. It caught all the heat that would have escaped backwards into the night sky and radiated it forward into the shelter. Blackwood stood at the entrance. The warmth was immediate, intense, and even. It was pure, radiant heat. He took his readings. Time, 9:30 p.m. Ext. Temp, 22°. Into temp, center, sleeping area, 54 degrees, 12°. Into temp, insulated back wall, interior, 40 y 8 chat dagger, 9 chat child. The data was staggering. Vane's shelter, using less wood, was maintaining a temperature 42 degrees warmer than Greely's. Vane himself was sitting on his bough bed, mending a snowshoe in his shirt sleeves. Blackwood, a man of science, asked Vane to explain the system. Vane, in his quiet, methodical way, obliged. He pointed to the layers. The first layer was the ground. The earth, 18 inches down, is 30 degrees, he said, which was true. It was a stable 30 to 32 degrees, or 0 degrees C. My floor is 18 inches below, the frost line. The ground isn't taking my heat, it's giving it. The second layer was the floor insulation, 2 feet of springy fir boughs. A 2-foot mattress of trapped air, Vane said. It keeps the warmth of my body from ever touching the cold. The third and most critical layer was the wall. Greely's log wall is solid, Vane explained, but wood is cold. It conducts heat. This wall, it's mostly air. He pulled back a small flap of birch bark. Blackwood saw the tightly packed moss and duff. 14 inches of dead air. The cold can't cross it. The heat can't leave it. The fourth layer was the fire system. The fire reflector wall, Vane explained, doubled the available radiant heat, focusing it precisely onto the sleeping area. The shelter was a parabolic mirror, and the occupant was at the focal point. Finally, Vane pointed to the roof line, a small 4-inch smoke hole at the very top, which he could partially cover with a piece of bark. The bad air goes up. The fresh air comes in, over the fire, so it's warm when it reaches me. It was not a hut. It was a complete, integrated thermal management system. The test came in the 3rd week of January. A false thaw, common to New England, brought a day of sleet and 34-degree temperatures, soaking everything. Then the front passed. The temperature dropped, not overnight, but in 6 hours. It fell from 34 degrees to 30 degrees, 34 degrees C, a brutal 64-degree plunge driven by a 40-mile-per-hour northwest wind. This was not just cold. It was a killer. In Greely's camp, it was chaos. Their bough huts, now coated in a thick shell of ice, became colder than the outside air. The ice conducted heat away with terrifying speed. The wind, which now had a sound like a screaming kettle, blew through every crack, atomizing the smoke and heat from the fires. The men were burning desperate amounts of wood, getting almost no warmth, and their clothes were still damp from the sleet. By morning, Dr. Blackwood was treating 3 men for severe frostbite. 2 of them, young axemen from New Brunswick named Paquette and Levesque, were in danger of losing their feet. The camp's productivity fell to 0. Greely's method had not just failed, it had become a death trap. Blackwood, fighting the wind, stumbled to Vane's shelter. He found the lean-to calm. The wind howled over the low-profile, earth-banked structure. The interior was dry. The fire reflector wall was working perfectly, creating a pocket of calm, warm air. Vane was melting snow for tea. His thermometer read 51 degrees. Blackwood did not ask. He ordered. The two frostbitten men, Paquette and Levesque, moved. Vane, seeing the gray, waxy look of their feet, simply nodded and made space. The addition of two more bodies, plus Blackwood, changed the shelter's dynamics. The humidity spiked. Vane's breath, which had been a light mist, now condensed heavily on the cool inner walls. "We'll have rain," Vane noted. He immediately widened the smoke hole by 2 inches. He then took his axe and cut a new 3-inch low vent at the floor level near the fire. "Air must move," he told Blackwood. He had instantly diagnosed the new problem and created a stack effect. Cool, fresh air was drawn in low, was preheated as it passed the fire, circulated through the living space to pick up moisture and carbon dioxide, and was then exhausted, moisture-laden, out the high vent. He was managing the indoor air quality. For the next 3 days, Vane's 12 by 8-foot lean-to served as a field hospital for 3 men and a doctor. Vane managed the fire and the ventilation. Blackwood managed the patients. The men who had mocked Vane days earlier as Digger and Mossman were now alive because of his moss pile. When the freeze broke, Dr. Blackwood returned to the main camp and wrote his official report to the Prentice Logging Company. It was not a medical report. It was an engineering one. It included his logbook with the daily 4-hour temperature readings. Page 12. Comparative Analysis of Winter Shelters. He calculated that Greeley's camp had consumed 3.5 cords of wood in 5 days just to fail at staying warm, resulting in 3 medical incapacitations. Vane's shelter, housing more men during the crisis, consumed an estimated 0.8 cords and resulted in 0 injuries. The report concluded, "The standard bough hut is not just inefficient. It is, in my medical opinion, criminally negligent in temperatures below 0. It relies on the endurance of the men. The Vane's insulated reflector shelter, however, relies on physics. It protects the men." Hiram Greeley was furious, but the numbers were undeniable. When the company superintendent arrived 2 weeks later, he read the report. His first order was not to cut timber. It was, "Hiram, you and your men will build 3 new shelters, and Mr. Vane will show you how." The following winter, 1889, the Prentice Logging Company's operations looked entirely different. The scattered, smoky brush huts were gone. In their place were orderly rows of semi-subterranean lean-tos, their long, 14-inch thick insulated back walls facing the north wind, their open fronts all facing a single, massive, community reflector wall. Silas Vane had been promoted to Winter Works Foreman, a title created for him, with a pay raise that exceeded Greeley's. His design had been slightly modified. The company now shipped in rolls of tar paper to use as a vapor barrier between the insulation layers, making them even more efficient. The Vane lean-to became the new standard, copied by trappers, surveyors, and other logging outfits across the state within 5 years. The ultimate lesson, the one Blackwood published in a Boston medical journal, was not just about the cold. It was a rejection of the idea that brute force was the answer to an extreme environment. The woods, Silas Vane had proven, did not reward the man who fought the hardest. It rewarded the man who understood the most. Survival was not a measure of endurance. It was, and always had been, a measure of design.